Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from Cape Town here in the Western Cape, South Africa. The podcast is presented with a view to providing a platform and voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It's dedicated to the individuals and community groups who are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. Last month saw the publication of a new book that looks at the challenges and conflicts that have accompanied Johannesburg's post-democratic growth and development. The book, titled The Agonistic City, State-City Strife in Johannesburg, questions the realities and the potential of the state's agonistic practices in response to service delivery issues as diverse and complex as the water conflict in Orange Farm, informal trading in the Central Business District, and the billing crisis. Each of these examples has challenged the city to respond to these many grievances lodged by its citizens across the spectrum of communities, from the most privileged to the most marginalised. Author Dr. Pernegger is ideally placed to reflect on these issues, having spent almost 15 years working within the City of Johannesburg administration between 1989 and 2006, a period of massive change in South Africa and the municipalities that served both the pre- and post-democratic South African dispensation. She's observed some of these issues firsthand and as they happened, through her doctoral research, her past roles working within municipalities for local and national governments in both South Africa and the United Kingdom, and her current role as advisor to the National Treasury's Government Technical Advisory Centre, or GTAC. She's considered these events within the academic environment and with the benefit of hindsight as a practitioner. An architect by trade, she also holds an executive MBA and a PhD in town and regional planning from the Witwatersrand University. As a former colleague of Lee's, I'm really looking forward to understanding her main conclusions and what the lessons for other cities and municipal administrations could be. I was absolutely delighted when she accepted the invitation to join us on the Talking Transformation podcast to reflect on the journey and to give a preview of what you can look forward to from the book. It was absolutely fantastic to chat to Lee and to revisit a city I still think of as home. As always, we hope you enjoy the episode and invite you to engage with us through the Talking Transformation podcast platform. You can leave a message on the Anchor podcast platform or engage with us through Twitter on Talking Transfo and the number 1, or you can get us on email through talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Enjoy the episode. So it's Wednesday, it's the day of reconciliation here in South Africa, and I'm absolutely delighted to have on the line, up in Johannesburg, Dr. Pernegger, also known as Lee. How are you doing, Lee? Are you well? How have you been keeping? How has lockdown been treating you? And looking forward to the festive season, no doubt.
Yes, definitely I'm looking forward to a festive season after a very long and very tough 2020.
I can believe it. And you've been busy in 2020, it would seem, publishing books. And keeping busy and keeping your hand in with GTAC?
Yes, I'm being busy, but of course the book being published in 2020 doesn't mean it was written in 2020. It's really a product out of many years of work, starting with a doctorate that I finished in 2016, and I wrote the book during the course of 2018 and 2019 and was lucky enough to get a decent London-based publisher, Z Books, to show some interest in the work.
You've mentioned your doctorate, and that was obviously an inspiration in terms of, I think you were working there with Professor Phil Harrison, who we've spoken to on the podcast before, and the Spatial Analysis City Planning Unit at WITS. It's one thing to finish a doctorate, which I would imagine is quite a slog and quite an effort, but then to say, look, I'm actually going to take it to a next level and look at it, to publish it and put it out there in a book format. What was the inspiration behind that?
The PhD itself wasn't really a slog. I mean, I'm not saying it's not an easy process, because it was quite difficult to make a transition from being a practitioner to an academic, which process I don't believe I've made very well, but one can only try. So the book was really an extension of that doctorate. So the doctorate itself, for me, was an opportunity to take a step back on my own experiences as a practitioner in local government, whether that was in South Africa or in the UK. And even when I was working in National Treasury, I was working exclusively on local government issues. And so the doctorate, as I was saying, was really that chance to take a step back and try and recalibrate my experiences and see what they actually meant for me in a kind of a broader context of all the experiences around conflict that I'd had, what did they actually mean? And was there something in there that I could look at in a different way, as opposed to having been in those moments and being quite stuck and not being able to see the forest for the trees? So what I'd hoped to do with the book is actually take those lessons that I'd learned through the doctoral studies and say, what can I tell people that might be helpful to them as practitioners or interesting to them as academics, because I'm trying to target both audiences, about conflict and about conflict in the work that the state does, from the perspective of the state, which is also something that's quite unusual, because a lot of people have written about conflict and about conflict in service delivery, which is what I've done. But very, very few have actually spoken about how the state has responded to that conflict over a long period of time.
This concept of agonism, what exactly is that? And why did you choose that as almost the research frame and ultimately the title of your book?
Agonism is a political theory that's been popularized by a Belgian theorist called Chantal Mouffe. And I think I almost fell into it by accident when I was working on my doctorate in the early days with Phil Harrison. And I thought, this sounds actually quite interesting. I wonder if it's something that we can explore a little bit more from the context of how the state works. And so agonism, the way that Mouffe has put it is, and I'm going to read out of the book, is namely the conflict between adversaries which mutually and respectfully recognize the legitimacy of each other's view, is seen as a positive force for change that potentially produces outcomes beneficial to ordinary citizens. And that, for me, that sounded really intriguing. As somebody who's not entirely comfortable with conflict, as I think many of us are,
sure.
How can we, and who sees maybe conflict as something quite destructive, and who probably treated it as quite destructive when I was working, for example, with informal trade in the late early 90s. I thought, wow, this sounds really intriguing. So what Mouffe does is, because she sees conflict in a kind of a more constructive way, she places contestation rather than only cooperation at the heart of democratic governance. And this is quite an important concept, because in democracy, and in the way that I think practitioners and planners are taught, we try to push conflict either by placating it or suppressing it to the sidelines of democracy, rather than placing it centrally and saying, well, what does that mean for how you engage with a particular issue that is underlying that conflict. So that for me was like really quite fascinating. And that is really the heart of the book. Although the book itself, I must be honest, is, because I'm not a political theorist, let me get that quite straight. I'm a practitioner, right? So the book is really a set of stories within stories. So the agonistic part of it is one chapter, but there's a thread of it that runs through the book as well. So even if you're not interested in agonism and you have absolutely no support for the concept, you can still read the book as a set of stories about what has happened with conflict in the city of Joburg, and what has happened with respect to informal traders over a long period of time, and how has the bureaucracy itself evolved to dealing with conflict? How has it engaged with processes of conflict, and so on?
When we think of conflict, it's so prevalent in South Africa. Not a week goes by where we're not, whether it's in Cape Town, whether it's in eThekwini, up in Johannesburg, there's constant conflict. And I assume one of the things you were trying to get out of this was, are there some common lessons learned? Are there, institutional approaches to, if I hear you rightly, you're basically saying, how do you embrace it? You say put it at the center of the argument as opposed to something that's to be avoided. Am I sort of understanding that correctly?
Yes, but it took me a long time to try and find out what those conclusions might be. And the starting point was really to say, well, what is the conflict? Because even that is defined in very many different ways, even within Johannesburg, but certainly amongst all of those within the state. So my starting point was to say, all right, let's have a look at service delivery protests, in inverted commas, in Johannesburg between 1996, shortly after the first local government elections, democratic local government elections were held, right up to 2016, which is at the time when the city political governance structures changed from being primarily ANC-led to DA coalition-led. So in that period, even defining what service delivery protest might mean was quite difficult. So I narrowed that down to saying it's any protest that tackles issues that the local government is meant to be addressing in terms of its service delivery. So, for example, that would be anything to do with water service delivery, housing to some extent, but certainly human settlement development is something that is, and planning is something that is quite central to local government, as well, of course, as basic service delivery issues around billing and so on. And that's quite a wide spectrum it's already as it is. It doesn't take into account a whole range of other kinds of protests that might be related to the Gautrain or to national housing processes and so on.
Right.
So within that frame, I was able to identify over 450 protests, and just listing them and trying to understand how they played out time after time after time was quite a struggle, because very few have looked at service delivery protests playing out over a long period of time and how the city has engaged with those protests over time. So there may be those that write about service delivery protests from the perspective of the protesters themselves and how they are trying to fashion an identity for themselves, or how they're trying to
craft their agenda, find their place, yeah?
Well, yeah, increase their access to services provided by the state, or enhance their rights about, for example, water or land and so on. That was quite an interesting journey, was to see that there's actually very little coverage of how the state has actually responded. And there's almost, when I started the journey, I thought, well, maybe the state isn't even responding. And at the end of that journey, I think I came to the conclusion, well, the state does respond. It's just, it's very opaque and it's very slow and it's quite complicated, isn't it always? The response is not always hitting the expectation or the needs that are raised by protesters.
So you've already starting to talk about some of the conclusions that you found, the idea that state does respond, etc. But let's go back to the beginning, Lee. Your history with the city and almost those issues of the day as you remembered them at the time. I mean, you've already talked about water issues, and I think in the book you talk about the Orange Farm water crisis. You've talked about informal trading in the CBD as another one, and I think the billing crisis, which, you know, anybody who read the papers over the last however many years would know that Joburg has been through significant challenges with its billing arrangements. Those are three of the examples. So maybe just take us back to first question, actually. Why 1996? Was that because of the sort of the coming together post 94 elections of the new transitional arrangements? And obviously 2000 becomes the mega cities where we see Tshwane, Joburg, Cape Town, etc. formed. But yeah, so just take us back to the formation, the foundations, 1996, and how you remembered some of those events almost on the timeline and the case studies that you looked at in the book.
Yes, well, I started in 1996 because it was, in a way, it is kind of easier to split up the trajectory of the institutional development of Johannesburg in 5-year terms, which corresponded loosely to the mayoral terms.
Right.
So the end of 1995 was the first local government elections in Johannesburg, 1996 for many other municipalities in South Africa. So it seemed a good point to start. You could have picked it anywhere. And in fact, in the book, I do make reference to some build-up or lead-up to some of the events as a backdrop to some of the stories that predates 1996, because, of course, no story just starts. So it wasn't a dark and stormy night and everything starts from that night. There's a build-up to where
the dark and stormy night
start,
had been
right?
many years prior to that, right?
And for me, although the book is not a memoir, please, under no circumstances must anyone think it's a memoir, because I was there for part of the story and in a way quite blind to some of the things that were happening. I was aware at the time that we were on the doorstep of this quite incredible transition to something different. And it was very exciting at that time. And it was very experimental, and a lot of innovative practices were being developed and implemented. And it was so exciting. And it was very heart-sore to realize that some of the things that were happening on the ground were not quite so appreciative of the efforts. In a way, I think the book helped me to kind of go back as an academic rather than as a practitioner, to step outside myself. And I think maybe this is also a lesson perhaps for other practitioners, is that we don't, when you're in the middle of things, you don't get a chance to be able to step back and say, well, what is actually happening in this moment? And what does that mean for how you proceed and how you move forward? And so that's why I looked at the stories in the way that I did, was to try and understand what was actually happening with the wisdom of hindsight and as an academic and trying to be quite rigorous about that, although that's always a lot harder to do than it sounds, was to be able to then to say, okay, these are the things I think were happening at the time. And so even when I look back on my own responsibility for informal trade in the 90s, I can say, there are things here that I might have actually done differently if I knew then what I know now. I don't think we did things badly per se. I don't want to paint myself with a bad brush here. But honestly, there is some benefit in being able to take a step back and look back with a different set of eyes, a new set of eyes, and say, okay, what does this actually mean? But also to compare it perhaps to other stories that are unfolding at the time, which I was quite oblivious about, except in the most simple way.
Clearly, right now in 2020, we're living through an extremely what would you call it, epoch-changing event of the pandemic. In Cape Town, we had the real worry of the water crisis, and the idea of 4.5 million people, not having water. Those were sharp, defining moments in a career. But often at the time, over a long period of decades that you're talking, I think you have 3 decades working in the public space. We often don't recognize the moment to be a sort of policy defining, or these are necessarily game changing initiatives. It happens through stealth and time and it's this learning that this journey that you've been on, and that we don't necessarily recognize at the time the importance and the significance of some of the challenges that are facing us. I mean, some of them are perennial, human settlements, challenges of where do we house millions of people in South Africa who have previously denied land and housing. How do we afford and provide infrastructure and social amenities for them? But I mean, there are others which come along and come knocking at the door, and maybe headlines for a couple of days, but then continue to be on the undercurrent of the headlines and remain issues for those communities. I mean, are these some of the things that you would agree with, or in my own reflection in thinking about this, does this make sense to you, Lee, or did you find it slightly different?
I think you're right. The challenges are there. They're numerous. Some of them are crisis proportions, like the pandemic, like water scarcity, like lack of service delivery, lack of housing. These things are there, no debate. But the thing that I probably would focus on is like, what does the state do in those situations? So you mentioned something earlier in that little introductory speech about some of the changes that happen are so small and that things happen by stealth. So I think what I've observed in writing this book and doing the research for it and the doctorate, and also writing a paper on informal practices of the state, is there's a few things that are going on. One is that everyone looks at the big banner type of initiatives that a city might be doing. The big ribbon cutting initiatives, these look like big changes, new policies being introduced and so on. Those things are important because they do mark a transition point, but they probably have only come into being after quite a number of years of prodding to get to that point, and a lot of workshopping and participation and consultation. You being in government, you will have known this. But there's also a whole range of other changes that happen that are very different. So they are incremental changes that happen, as you say, by stealth, but they also are related to the more informal practices that happen while people like you and me are struggling to battle with a specific challenge that is happening right there and then on the ground, right? And so those informal practices are a lot less studied than the formal ones. And even the formal ones and their effects on kind of democratic outcomes are poorly studied. But the informal ones are quite fascinating because it really does come down to how individuals feel a democracy should look, and the kind of pressure that they're succumbing to, and the sets of other kind of contextual issues that might be driving them to make a decision. So I remember speaking to a senior legal advisor in the city of Joburg who was very upset about a particular property that was created for homeless people being moved from one bad building in the city in the city center to another building. And they were supposed to have signed leases, which had been workshopped and all the rest of it. And on the point of them standing outside the doors with all their trucks and their possessions, they hadn't actually signed the leases. And so succumbing to political pressure, they were allowed to move in. And for 10 years later, that building is occupied and over-occupied, and it's become a slum. And the thing that he said was, that really stuck in my mind, he says, you see, this is what happens. Temporary becomes permanent. And that is so true of so many of the incremental changes, which layered together actually make quite a big change or set of changes after a couple of years. Right? They're quite foundational changes. And I think ultimately we'll see that things will continue to affect policy, because once you've made a decision like that, you have to live with that decision.
Sure. It was almost the unintended consequences of trying to do something in the moment that have a much longer term impact and an outcome, right?
Yeah. And I think also at the time when I saw those things happening, I thought, oh, this is not good. But actually, maybe they're not that bad either. But we don't look at those and we don't assess them. So it's not really something that I looked at in the book, but rather in the paper. Sure. I think they do warrant a lot more scrutiny than we give them, all of these informal actions. You know, when a politician decides X, Y, Z, does anybody go back and say, well, what has this done for policy in the longer term? What has it done for a particular project's trajectory? Has it been a good outcome or a bad outcome, or, as is typical, a mixed outcome, and in what proportions? Yeah. And so now where to? What kind of precedent does it set for other projects and policies of this nature?
And Lee, just to clarify, I mean, I mentioned some of those case studies. Are there any others that you'd like to illustrate that were chosen by you to really showcase a particular angle or personality from these Johannesburg case studies?
Well, when I started the process and I looked at all of these hundreds of protests, I looked at them from this broad city perspective, and then I realized, well, that's probably not that helpful, because I can see already, even at a simplistic level, that each story has got its own little patterns and themes that's very specific to that particular context. And that's why I also looked at 3 different stories within the broader story of conflict in service delivery protest in Joburg. And I particularly chose those 3 because they are so different to each other. They dealt with different sectors, different spatial areas in the city, and different classes, people, groups, and so on. So the first one was around informal trading in the inner city, which has a very specific and very public face.
For sure.
Although they are a very small user group within the entire city. And then the next one was to look at an informal settlement. Well, it was once upon a time an informal settlement. It's still called an informal settlement by many officials today, but it's much truer to say it's a new settlement that has a mix of some informal settlement within it, but quite a lot of state-led housing development as well. Looking particularly at the water-related struggles.
Sorry, that's the Orange Farm example.
Orange Farm,
yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And Orange Farm also is quite interesting for me because it's a brand new settlement. It's as big as some small towns are in the UK. Absolutely. It grew from literally a handful of families, maybe 200-300 people, in 1989 to over 200,000 people by the end of 2016. It's a phenomenal amount of growth. I mean,
exponential growth, right?
In any government, that would be a lot of stuff to handle. And then to add that dimension of the kind of the water crisis to that was quite interesting to me as well. And of course, it's a new community, brand new community. There's a very few roots within that particular environment at the time, and it only grew into a community as I think maybe even the water struggles has created a different kind of community, well, different to other parts of the city. And then the third story I thought was quite interesting was not such a loud set of conflicts as one would expect in service delivery conflicts. And that's also what I meant by there's not really a common agreed definition of what a service delivery protest actually is. And that was the story of the billing battle by the middle class. And so this is a much quieter form of protest that's been bubbling up also pretty much since the 90s. So I looked at a particular very strong set of middle class communities within the central core of Johannesburg, predominantly white, but not exclusively so, and how they have fought this battle as well over the years has been quite fascinating and very different. And they are not also above having their own street protests from time to time too, as a pray tell, but they will look for other ways of protesting. And the state, of course, has had to look for other ways to address their concerns. And in doing so have probably created even more service delivery protests around billing.
So there's the 3 case studies. Again, just in summary, it's the informal trading in the CBD, it's the water issues in Orange Farm, and then this idea of the billing crisis or the billing issues, let's call it. And say 3 different areas, 3 different almost income groups, and I guess many sort of racial profile behind that. What was the city's response? What did you find were the city's ability to respond, its reach in that response, and the satisfaction of the response?
Fascinatingly, it had actually different approaches to each of those communities, although there are some similarities, of course, across the different communities. But so in the case of Orange Farm, there was very much to the service delivery protests in the very immediate and short term. So there's different levels of responses straight away when the protest is happening. Very immediate, very much showing that the city is largely anti-conflict and quite forcible in suppressing protests, especially if they were violent. But the longer term responses to those protests did focus on the issues under contention and to the root causes underlying those protests. So there was an attempt to address protests not on a one-by-one basis, because that requires a lot of resources, but to try and address collectively kind of the issues around poverty and around the lack of water provision, or the lack of enough water provision, or the way it was providing water in Orange Farm. So, for example, it increased the free monthly water allocation from 6 to 10 kilolitres in 2005. It introduced a new proper pricing structure for the water tariffs, also in 2005, due to the pressure from protesters and activists. It suspended its Tsinamanzi operation pending a court ruling, because, of course, the protesters took the city to the court. So the city could have continued, but it chose not to continue with that operation to install prepaid meters, which is what the battle was about. And then it introduced other things like an indigency management policy and various kinds of kind of increased levels of spatial and economic planning for Orange Farm that hadn't been there originally in the 1990s, even though Orange Farm was part of the city. In fact, it took the city quite a long time to kind of incorporate the Orange Farm community into its broader strategic plans. So that was the one thing. And then, so gradually over time, over the period, it was clear that Orange Farm was considered to be an essential part of the city. There were increasing resources directed to it, financial resources, planning resources, and the like. So that was quite fascinating to see that increasing acknowledgement of the area. And I think protests has definitely had something to do with that. And I'm sure when you speak to officials, they acknowledge that as well. Then in the case of informal trading, I think in the 1990s, the state was very amenable to working with the informal traders and trying to resolve what I think they felt were kind of urban management issues. Although, of course, informal trading sector has a whole range of dimensions and challenges related to it around economic development, poverty alleviation, poor city management and poor city governance, especially around how space is being used and the contestation between traders and shopkeepers and formal businesses and vehicles and so on. So initially there seemed to be this kind of good working together, mutual policy development, implementing projects, setting up management systems for informal traders, and then the informal trading bylaws were eventually promulgated. And that was also quite a process, which I talk about in the book. And there was quite a bit of contestation between the city and the provincial government on that level. But once the informal trading bylaws were introduced and enforcement began, which is always a necessary complement, I think any development practitioner will tell you, you have to have development, you have to have enforcement, and there must be some sort of balance, and that balance continuously shifts. So as the bylaws were introduced and the enforcement teams were set up, traders' associations became particularly vociferous, especially against the city. And as more markets were introduced and rentals were asked for and frequently not paid, or if they were paid, they weren't paid quickly enough to support kind of the user pays principle that was inherent, then increasingly the tension broke out. Now, of course, sometimes if markets were being created, some people were in the market and some people were not. And those that were in the market were complaining about paying rents, and those who were out the market were complaining because they weren't in the market, and then they were trading around the market, which was meant to be a clear space. So you can see there was the city's actions as well, which is also a thread that runs through these stories. In a way, trying to resolve the conflict also fueled new and different types of conflicts. And that was quite difficult. The city, in this particular case, instead of becoming increasingly accommodating of informal traders, became increasingly hostile towards them, culminating in the dreaded Operation Clean Sweep in 2013, which was really, I think, a dark moment for the city. And I think since then, the informal trade management has really struggled to find a new kind of relationship with informal traders. So that story is not finished, and I think it'll take a long time for it to get to the next stage. And then with the billing crisis, the interesting thing for me here was that there was a certain amount of denial by the city of the middle class's legitimate concerns that they were not getting their bills. And the bills it sounds like maybe it's a simple thing, but the bill is a symbol of the relationship between the city and its customer, and the customer here is the middle. That's the middle class person is sitting there, and everything in that relationship is all hanging on that bill. So if that bill is wrong, the relationship is flawed, and it's a problematic thing. The billing crisis also came out of, it had its roots in the city's long institutional development around how it runs its business. And I think one of the councillors, Councillor Walters, reminded me during the research process that the city is not just a city, it's a multi-billion rand set of businesses. There are over 100 moving parts here, departments, entities, agencies, and so on, that all have to talk to each other in some way. And when it comes to billing, they don't, and they haven't been speaking very well to each other. And the customer, the middle class, has felt the flack. And the customer, of course, the middle class is important to the city because these are the people that pay the rates. And this is the income that the city needs in order to do all the other lovely things it needs to do with informal traders and Orange Farm and so on. And of course, also in middle class areas, sorting out potholes and whatnot. So initially, I think the city actually did deny, certainly to the outside, that there was a problem. Although there's quite clear evidence that it introduced various initiatives to try and address the billing crisis, like Pakama, a program to create an improved and single billing platform. But that process itself also then introduced other problems into the billing process, which further created all sorts of tensions and whatnot. And so the billing crisis itself, I think, became quite a strong political tool for the opposition party to use against the incumbent party. And there were allegations of sabotage and spies and whatnot.
Intrigue and plot.
Yes, and I see even those have been in reverse. They've been reversed from the one to the other, sabotage and spies and whatnot. So billing itself has become a bit of a tool, a political tool, to gain some sort of political advantage. I do believe from the evidence of the research that the billing situation had very much improved. And I'm not saying that there haven't been mistakes since then, and that certain customers have felt the burn of that. But it certainly has improved. I guess that billing story is never over, because as the city grows and it grows its administrative processes to cover increasingly greater sections of the population, the billing challenges will continue, perhaps in a different form, and will bubble up in different places.
Lee, I mean, you've talked there a bit about the party politics of Johannesburg, and that had been fairly constant up until the last municipal election. And obviously next year we go back into another municipal election where the Johannesburg, I would expect, to be highly contested. How important do you think the different personalities within the administration in shaping approaches and the outcomes and the responses to the issues were? So there are mayors, there are city managers, there are individual personalities within a city administration that can make and break them. That's been my sort of experience. And did you pick up on any of this that went beyond just the party politics?
Let me answer that question in two ways. So in the book, I make reference to a conversation that I had with Christine Walters, who's a councillor for the ANC and a member of the mayoral committee, holding a variety of portfolios in city politics since 1994. And we were talking about how things had shifted from the beginning of Amos Masondo's term, first 5-year term, to the second 5-year term. And so she says, you had a disturbance in the political environment. She said she had the sense that until then, the ANC with the alliance had always managed the space, and that the former cohesiveness of the political parties, civil society, and communities had largely disintegrated. So there was something happening within the kind of the broader tripartite alliance. But there was also, I think, a shift in the bureaucracy itself from that innovative experimental stuff that was happening in the early 2000s to something that was more formalized and a little bit more mechanistic towards the end of 2010. So that must have brought its own kind of dynamics to how officials and politicians then engage with the public. So that's on the one level. So I can't talk about politics because I wasn't studying politics per se.
Sure.
But the administration itself also has an identity, if you can call it that shifts as it has its own political forces exerted upon it over time. So that was the one part of what I would like to sort of mention. And then the second part was, yes, about individuals. Individuals have an absolutely critical role to play in how issues are approached and how outcomes are defined and managed, especially when it comes to protests. I like to think that in an agonistic city that you will have individuals that have this very high, and I use this term in the book, ethos of agonism, who are able to look at protest and not be threatened by it, who can bring it to the center, to the fore, and look at the issues that are being put on the table. No matter how loudly and violently they might be put on the table, those issues are still valid. And then to be able to try and make some inroads into addressing those issues. So in the book, I refer to a particular individual called Opa in Orange Farm, who's a fascinating individual because he's a politician, he's an activist with the South African National Civic Organization, SANCO, very well known in South Africa, but he also lives in Orange Farm, and he became an official. So I think here the city actually used his multiple identities for the benefit of trying to deal with service delivery protests. And I remember Opal, when I was interviewing him, said to me that he had managed to reduce the amount of service delivery protests in Orange Farm a lot, quite a lot, he said. Now, I don't know how you measure that, but it was quite clear that there was a dip when he took on the role of, I think, stakeholder relationship manager in the regional office in the city of Joburg within Region G in Orange Farm. So I think he obviously had a way how to engage with people, and he had a legitimacy that maybe other officials might not have had because of his political connections and his political kudos, but also the fact that he lived there. So I think he probably, him as an individual, not only because I think he has that ethos of agonism, but also because of who he is, was able to engage with service delivery protests in a way that maybe other officials might not have been able to. But then he couldn't always do that. I mean, there was, for example, one of your colleagues in the city planning told me a planning process that was being held for Orange Farm. And as they were talking about the plans that they'd proposed for Orange Farm, a whole group of very militant service delivery protesters came in and they're jumping up and down and toying in the session. And she said she felt extremely threatened.
Yeah.
So at that time, Opal was able to come and just at least calm the situation, but they were not able to get the stakeholder engagement about the RSDF back on track. So that was actually eventually approved by the council without stakeholder input. So, Pete, yes, individuals are important, but they also have their own limits. So not everything is about the individuals. But again, also not everything is about the institution, the organization itself.
I mean, it does strike me that, given the size, the scale, and often an inertia within an organization, such as, a metro municipality, it almost is astonishing that anything does get done. And I do think that particularly in a year like this year where we've seen COVID and, again, talking from a Cape Town experience of the water crisis again, it does speak to a resilience and a competency within that institution that I guess we should take some comfort from, recognizing that, we don't always get it right. But is that, this idea that in spite of all the challenges, in spite of whether it's rail issues, whether it's, as you say, billing issues, whether it's the contestations in the central business district, that the city does continue. It continues to grow. It continues to develop in a particular way. You've talked about orange farming, and a classic example, and there are many in each city around South Africa where informal growth is actually defining in many respects the new city, and certainly the accommodating many more people than it has done in history. And I mean, is that something that you were able to consider from your practitioner's perspective, that it's almost a miracle that anything does get done, and it speaks to this idea of a real robustness to the institutional machinery?
Yeah, I think I was a bit like you. When I started the studies, I kind of felt like, oh, this is so frustrating. We've worked so hard. We've achieved nothing. Nothing's changed. Everything's the same. And it's very easy to say from the outside and even from the inside that nothing gets done. But quite frankly, I don't believe that's true. Because even when you start looking for how the city has responded over time, the collective efforts of a number of individuals and departments create sets of layers of changes and shifts that are not always apparent at the time, but might become more apparent over a longer period of time, which is what I think you see in the book. Over a period of 20 years, things do happen. So, Pete, what I look at in the book is like, what are the practical possibilities of agonism in looking at governance and what we do on a day-to-day basis, or maybe not on a day-to-day basis, but on a month-to-month or in a year-to-year basis. So firstly, we could adopt as a state some principles around an agonistic governance ethos. In other words, place conflict more centrally. Find ways how to at least document what conflict is happening. Even to this day, I've never been able to get the list of service delivery protests from Joburg Metro Police Department. I had to use other sources. But take that information, then and look at it and put it centrally. Try and understand what it might actually mean for your day-to-day business of running the state. Secondly, you could adopt a managing and not a resolving conflict mindset. In other words, don't try and resolve conflict, because it ain't going to happen. Rather, just try and manage the dynamics of what is happening. Then thirdly, if you adopt those 2 points, agonism could serve as a foundation for the state to widen its repertoire of practices by drawing on examples from elsewhere. So in other words, to try and be a little bit more agonistic in its day-to-day behavior. So for example, if you're engaging with a community that's very hostile about something, don't set the agenda, let them set the agenda, literally. Fourthly, you could use agonism as an ideal in improving governance practices, but I think that might have some limitations, which I'll go into in the book, but I won't do that here. So you could use agonism to support tackling these very wicked problems that underlie the intractable conflicts, because you know that it's going to be just to and fro. These are wicked problems. These are not things that can just be resolved by chucking more money at it or more resources of other sorts. And then lastly, I think what agonism doesn't show us is that actually antagonism has got quite a strong role to play in how changes happen in the city. When something is incredibly hostile and antagonistic, it prompts those in the city to sit up and take notice of what's going on. And I think that has a value which is not always recognized, because we're so busy trying to push that antagonism to the side. But I think those are the 5 kind of possibilities that an agonistic approach might bring you within a city practitioner space.
I would be interested to know from you, what didn't make the cut, and if you were doing volume 2 of this Johannesburg book, were there other areas or issues that you think would be worthy of further consideration? And maybe if you were to choose another city, having, now with your National Treasury hat on and, your ability to look across the country, is there anywhere that you said, that would be an interesting case study to look at further?
There's plenty of room for plenty books. Maybe not by me, but I like to think I'm a one-book wonder.
Have you had enough?
Anyway, I think, within the city of Joburg, there are stories that are not yet told. It's a housing story, the housing in Thembelihle story. Right. Although Siri has done a little bit of work around that. There is so much. There's a pothole story, for example. There's a whole book to write about potholes, believe it or not. So yes, I think those are stories that are not at all told. And if I had to look at other cities, I think we could even look at cities across the world. Because although service delivery protests in inverted commas seems to be a kind of a South African phenomenon, every city experiences some level of conflict, whether it's very loud or very quiet. And so I think this kind of approach, the agonistic approach, might be applied to literally any government, anywhere. So yes, there I think are plenty of books to write about agonism and agonistic practices and service delivery and conflict and protests. And certainly I think what I would probably encourage is for more to research and study and talk about and debate about how the state is responding to that, because that discussion is not really being held, certainly not in very many public places.
Final question. What has the reaction been to the book? If I'm not mistaken, you've got your book launch in the new year, and that's happening in tandem with another publication. Maybe you want to just reflect on that. But generally, what has been the reaction? I think it came out in November this year. What's the immediate response been from colleagues, from people you've worked with, from people you've studied with, and the support that you've received?
It's early days. I think COVID has also put a little bit of a kibosh on too many events. So in a normal course of events, you would have a nice big wine and cheese, and you'd have a big flurry of press activity and so on. So I haven't had that. We've had lots of interest through social media, especially LinkedIn, Instagram.
Fantastic.
About the book. And I'm very gratified by that, because for me, it's not about how many thousands of people are going to listen to the podcast and read the book. It only takes one or two to make a difference. And
sure.
You, the one or two you out there, are the ones that I want to talk to with this book and this podcast.
But that's fantastic. And then I guess final question, where can people find out more about the book online? I think you mentioned it's a London publisher, but does that mean that there is a PDF version or ebook rather, that people can purchase, or is it that they need to buy it from overseas? How can people get their hands on a copy of the book?
So Pete, unfortunately, the book is not available as a PDF, and that's partly a contractual matter related to signing the book contract before COVID was a reality. So we have a hardcover version of the book, which you can order online from Zed Books. That's Z-E-D, Zed Books. So that's www.zedbooks.net. And then just type in Agonistic City or Johannesburg or Lee Pernegger, and you will find the landing page for the book. Although it's a hardcover book, it makes it, of course, it's very pricey usually. We have a promo code, which is City35, capital letters, CITY 35, City35, and that's valid until the end of December and gives you a 40% discount. For those of you in South Africa, that means that probably pays for the courier.
Well, that's still a great deal at 40% off. So yes, that's fantastic.
And then we should see it in the bookstores, hopefully early 2021, if it isn't already in place now. But I know for certain that Love Books in Melville, Punt for You Love Books, will be stocking a few copies. So you know where to get it.
Fantastic. And a signed copy, if we come knocking at your door, you'll sign it for us, right?
Of course. All three of you.
Hey, there's going to be more than three. That's a fact. Lee, many thanks. I really appreciate, again, you've taken out, we've been talking now for just over an hour, the scope, the complexity, the challenges, the realities on the ground that not just Joburg, but all of the cities and towns around the country are facing. I think there's so much to learn and listen from your book. I'm certainly looking forward to going through it in more detail during the festive period. And I wish you well. I really do, Lee. Good luck with it. And I genuinely think that, volume 2 is worth thinking about. I know it's a slog, but maybe that's a conversation you and I can pick up in the new year. But in the meantime, have a lovely festive season. Look after yourself and your family, and hope to speak to you again in the new year.
Thank you, Pete. And to everyone out there, I learned about looking at conflict differently by writing this book, and maybe it can do the same for you.
Fantastic. Enjoy the rest of your day.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.